This door is a great example of a critical sanding project. Now, before I start talking about sanding this door though, there's something I'm reminded that I really need to share, and that is, as you can see, I put a piece of cardboard on top of my table that I was working on. The table is just an old rough outfeed table that sits behind my table saw. And I've literally had examples where I spent a whole bunch of time sanding one side of something, then flipped it over to sand the other side. And when I looked back at the first side that I had sanded, I'd actually scuffed it back up because it was sitting against something rough. So when you're doing sanding, you want to make sure that you've got a really clean surface that's going to protect the work that you've done, not create more work for yourself. Another general thing that crosses my mind is any kind of moisture will raise the grain on this wood. Even if I've sanded it perfectly, if I load it in my truck and I get a little bit of mist or there's some moisture on the road or something that gets on it, it's going to raise the grain back up, and there'll actually be spots that you'll see that you'll have to sand the whole thing over again. And sometimes, of course, those don't show up until you're ways down the pathway on getting it stained. Sweat in the summertime can be another thing that can really cause you problems, or if your hands are damp and you're sweating, then sweat will also raise grain. So it's great if you can work in a nice air-conditioned place or have a fan blowing over you or something to keep moisture from getting on that. And when you're transporting something that you worked on sanding, make sure that you protect it while you're transporting it. Wrap it up in some moving blankets. Clamp them face to face or something to where nothing's going to happen to them. And realistically, anything that you sand in the shop, and sometimes, of course, we're doing that sanding out on the job site in someone's garage or something, and it's not quite as big a deal. But if you are going to transport it, you probably ought to just go ahead and plan on making your last sanding pass on the job site when you got it in the area where it's going to be installed. So, enough about that. When you're sanding something like this door, you have to have a plan of how you're going to do it. Now, I talked about, was going to discuss, how do I decide what sander and what paper to use. One of the main thing that is going to determine that is, am I going to be staining or am I going to be painting? Now, staining, you have to be careful about scratches. You need a smooth surface, but maybe it's not quite as important to be level, because especially something that's stained a little bit darker, you're not going to see maybe just a slight, and I'm talking about very, very slight unevenness. But if I'm sanding something to paint, although it probably doesn't have to be sanded quite to the level of smoothness, and if there happen to be a few tiny scratches from sanding, from the random orbit sander or whatever, those aren't going to show up on the paint. But especially if you're painting a light color, if there's any kind of a little indentation, that's going to create a shadow, and it's really going to show up when you paint. So for paint grade, you need to really make sure that you're flat. You might not even have to go to quite as fine of a grit, because it doesn't need to be maybe quite as smooth. Matter of fact, generally when someone paints something, they're going to put a coat of primer on it, and then they're going to go back and sand that primer. When you're staining, you have to probably sand it to a little bit finer grit, which again, that's a higher number, remember, but maybe not quite as careful about making sure everything is 100% dead flat. Now, the other thing that's going to determine what kind of sander, what kind of paper and everything I'm going to use is, what am I sanding? If I'm sanding something like this, it's solid lumber, I'm probably going to need to start out with a more aggressive sandpaper, removing materials, especially this door is maple, which is really quite hard. If I was sanding pine, I would need to use probably as aggressive or as coarse a grit as I would starting on this maple to get it smoothed down. If I was sanding something that's like MDF, like I'm shelf with a nose attached or something, I don't really have to worry that much about what I'm doing to that wood. But now plywood shelf, where you have that very, very thin veneer of the plywood, is a total different story. And there I've got to be super careful not to burn through that veneer, because if it's going to stain and I somehow burn through that veneer, then it's just game over. There's nothing you can do. And it is kind of interesting when you are handling sheets of plywood. This is, I don't know if you call it a sanding tip, but it's really important. If you're handling sheets of plywood, whether it be in your truck or in your shop, on the job site, you want to be careful not to drag them back and forth too much over, because you can put some scuffs in it that will be hard to sand out. And as a general rule, any plywood that you're going to be staining, even if it looks perfectly smooth and flat, you generally want to go ahead and sand it at least a little bit. And again, depending on what type of plywood veneer it is, how much more you're going to sand. For instance, maple, we build a lot of cabinets out of maple these days, and do a lot of things out of maple because it's a very hard wood. It's readily available almost anywhere, and it really sands up slick. But I have known instances where people actually sanded it too smooth, maybe going down to 300 or 250 or something, and you can almost glaze this over to where it gets hard and slick, and it won't take stain at all. So there's kind of a happy spot between getting it smooth and getting rid of all the scratches and having it to where it'll take stain. But now let's talk just a little bit, since I've got this door up here, about the application of how I would sand it, because this door is pretty heavy and I don't want to bring it back up here again. So when I sanded this door, the first thing I did is I took a belt sander, and normally you want to do all of your sanding with a belt sander with the grain, because when you go cross grain, you get scratches that are hard to get out of. But something like this door, also very similar to the face frame of a cabinet, if you're going to use a belt sander, the first thing you do is you go across the short direction to flatten all these out. Then you come back, and the nice thing about a belt sander is, when I'm using this belt sander, I visually can line right up there with the edge of the sander. So I sand it back and forth like this on all these surfaces, get them flat, and then I came back and sanded very close over to that edge to get rid of as many of the cross grain sanding marks as I could, and sanded the whole length of this door, flipped it over and did the other length, and then of course repeated the same thing on the other side. Now, since I'm talking about this door and how I sand it, there's very, very few sanding operations that you start with a belt sander that you don't need to go back and do a little more sanding with a different type of sander. So the next thing that I did once I sanded this as carefully as possible is I took a random orbit sander, and I still use the same technique where I sanded, although the random orbit, you should be able to sand any direction you want because it's going around in this oscillating pattern, but I sanded back and forth across the joints, and then I sanded the length of it, and I sanded this down to about 125. This is going to stain fairly dark, and from what I found, if I go too much finer than that, maybe I could go to 150. If I get much more than that, I'm going to end up in a position where it starts to glaze over and it won't really take stain very well, and that's even harder on the painters. Now, I've got some other applications that I want to talk about sanding. I'm just trying to share some information as I go, but since I was talking about belt sander and sanding this, I would say that I start out with about 100 grit, which I generally don't use unless I'm just trying to really flatten something out. I generally don't use a belt sander much coarser than that. And I think I started out with maybe 100 grit on the random orbit and then went down to 125. But when you're using, especially using a belt sander, and it's somewhat true with any of the sanders, you don't want to be, you want to let the sander itself do the work. So when I was sanding this back and forth, I was basically just holding the sander and keeping it from running away from me, but I wasn't pushing down or anything, because if I start pushing down, I can make a little groove, and that's extremely hard to get. And that's the kind of thing that scares people about a belt sander, is that digging a rut or something that you have to get out. So kind of a key principle is let the sander and the sandpaper do the work. And if it's not taking off the material as fast as you feel like you need to, instead of pressing down and taking the chance of digging a hole or making a mess, just get a more aggressive sandpaper. If this had been, really up and down and rough, I might have gone to an 80 grit. There's been a very, very few times I've even used a 50 grit belt on a sander, but that's just for really flattening something out. There have been times like on a remodeling job or something where we had to sand a hump out of some floor or something like that where we used 50 grit, but generally speaking, that 50 grit is just for coarse grinding. So that's a lot about how I sanded this door. I've talked about how I would choose what tool I would use. It kind of depends on, again, what I'm sanding and whether I'm going to stain or paint. So I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to bring in 2 or 3 other things. I'm going to give you some more examples, just practical examples of how I would sand things.